The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the lumber auction yard in Millbrook, Oregon, where desperate people came to sell what remained of their broken lives. Among the weathered trucks and rusted machinery sat a young woman on a wooden grate, her thin coat offering little protection against the December cold. A hand-written cardboard sign beside her read, "Seeking employment and shelter, will work for room and board." What the burly lumberjack who approached her didn't know was that beneath her oversized sweater she was hiding a secret that would change both their lives forever. Sometimes the most unexpected purchases lead to the most extraordinary discoveries. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air bit sharp and clean as Tommy Brennan pulled his beat-up Ford pickup into the gravel lot of Mackenzie's monthly auction house. Steam rose from his coffee cup as he surveyed the familiar scene. Weathered men in flannel, shirts and work boots examining everything from chainsaws to furniture, their breath visible in the December cold. Tommy had been coming to these auctions for 3 years now, ever since he'd taken over his grandfather's logging operation in the Cascade Mountains. At 34, Tommy cut an imposing figure even among the other loggers. 6'3" width, shoulders broadened by years of swinging axes and hauling timber. His dark brown hair was always slightly tousled from working outdoors, and his green eyes held the kind of steady calm that came from preferring trees to people. Most folks in Millbrook knew him as the quiet Brennan boy who'd inherited old Samuel's land and kept to himself up in the mountains. What they didn't know was that the silence of his remote cabin had become a prison of loneliness that grew heavier with each passing season. Tommy's routine at the auctions was predictable. Check the tool lots first, maybe bid on some equipment if the price was right, grab lunch at Murphy's Diner, then head back to his mountain. Solitude. He developed this routine after his fiancée, Rachel, had left him 2 years earlier, claiming she couldn't handle the isolation and his inability to open up emotionally. Since then, Tommy had convinced himself that solitude was preferable to the risk of being hurt again. He was examining a set of logging chains when he first noticed her. She sat apart from the main crowd, perched on an old wooden crate near the auction house's side entrance, like a bird that had fallen from its nest. Everything about her seemed designed to take up as little space as possible. Her thin frame hunched against the cold, dark blonde hair, hanging like a curtain around her face, hands tucked deep into the pockets of a coat that had seen better seasons. But it was the sign beside her that made Tommy stop in his tracks. Seeking employment and shelter, will work for room and board. In all his years attending these auctions, Tommy had never seen someone advertising themselves alongside the used farm equipment and household goods. The sight stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, part curiosity, part recognition of desperation he understood too well. The woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with delicate features that spoke of better times. Her clothes were clean but worn, and she clutched a small duffel bag that seemed to contain everything she owned. Most telling were her shoes, leather flats completely unsuited for Oregon's winter weather, with thin soles that had probably already soaked through from the wet gravel. Tommy found himself watching her as the auction progressed, noting how she blinched whenever someone walked too close, how her eyes tracked every movement with the hypervigilance of someone who'd learned to expect trouble. She reminded him of the injured animals he occasionally found on his property, alert, defensive, ready to bolt at the first sign of danger. "That's Emma Caldwell," said a voice beside him. Tommy turned to see Bill Mackenzie, the auction house owner, following his gaze. "Been sitting there since we opened at 7 this morning. Came in on the Greyhound from California yesterday, according to Murphy at the diner." "She looking for work?" Tommy asked, surprising himself by speaking up. Bill shrugged, his weathered face creased with concern. Claims to be, but who knows what her real story is. Young woman like that, traveling alone with nothing but a duffel bag, usually means she's running from something or someone. Tommy absorbed this information, his gaze returning to Emma. There was something about her posture that spoke of careful control rather than defeat. Even sitting on that crate, in obviously desperate circumstances, she held herself with a dignity that suggested inner strength beneath the vulnerability. Anyone talk to her? Tommy found himself asking. Few folks did. Pete Morrison offered her cleaning work at his motel, but she turned it down when she found out it didn't include housing. The Hendersons were interested until they learned she doesn't have references or a permanent address. People are cautious, you know. Pretty young woman with no history, no family contacts, makes folks nervous. Tommy understood the hesitation. Small communities like Millbrook survived on trust and knowing everyone's business. A stranger, especially one in obvious distress, represented an unknown quantity that most people preferred to avoid. But something about Emma Caldwell's careful dignity reminded Tommy of himself in those first months after Rachel left. Proud, hurt, determined not to let anyone see how completely lost he felt. The auction continued around them, the auctioneer's rapid-fire calls mixing with the sound of bidding and casual conversation. Tommy went through the motions of examining merchandise, but his attention kept drifting back to the young woman who sat like a statue among the chaos of commerce. It was nearly noon when Tommy made his decision. He approached slowly, noting how Emma's body tensed as he drew near. Up close, he could see that her blue eyes held flecks of grey that made them seem almost silver in the winter light. She was prettier than he'd initially realized, with high cheekbones and a stubborn chin that suggested she wasn't easily broken, despite her current circumstances. "Excuse me," Tommy said, his voice gentler than usual. "I'm Tommy Brennan. I own a logging operation up in the mountains, and I couldn't help but notice your sign." Emma's eyes met his briefly, before looking away, her hands tightening on her duffel bag. "I'm Emma Caldwell. Are you looking for help?" Her voice was softer than he'd expected, with a slight rasp that suggested she'd been doing more talking than sleeping lately. There was also something else in her tone, a carefully controlled wariness that made Tommy wonder what had driven her to this desperate measure. "Might be," Tommy replied carefully. "What kind of work experience do you have?" Emma's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I can cook, clean, do basic bookkeeping. I'm good with my hands, learn quickly, and I work hard." She paused, then added with quiet intensity, "I just need a chance." Tommy found himself studying her more closely. Despite her obvious desperation, there was no pleading in her voice, no attempt to manipulate through pity. She was stating facts and asking for an opportunity based on merit rather than sympathy. "The work would be basic household management," Tommy said slowly, thinking through the practicalities even as he spoke. "Cooking, cleaning, maybe helping with some paperwork for the business. It's isolated up there. Nearest neighbor is 5 miles away, and town is a 20-minute drive down the mountain." Something flickered in Emma's eyes. Relief, maybe, or recognition. "Isolation doesn't bother me," she said. "I prefer quiet." Tommy sensed there was more to that statement than simple preference, but he didn't push. Instead, he found himself making an offer he hadn't planned to make when he woke up that morning. "Room and board, plus $200 a week cash," he heard himself saying. "Trial period of 1 month to see if it works out for both of us." Emma's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment her careful composure cracked to reveal desperate hope. "You're serious?" "Dead serious, but I should warn you, it really is isolated up there. Some people find the silence unsettling after a while." "Mr. Brennan," Emma said, and there was something in her voice that made Tommy pay closer attention. "I've learned that there are much worse things than silence. The statement carried weight that spoke of recent pain, and Tommy found himself nodding in understanding. He'd learned the same lesson, though perhaps through different circumstances. "When would you want me to start?" Emma asked. "Today, if you're ready. I was planning to head back up the mountain after the auction anyway." Tommy watched as Emma processed this offer, noting the rapid calculation in her eyes as she weighed options he could only guess at. Whatever had brought her to this auction yard, whatever she was running from, it was serious enough that accepting a job with a complete stranger seemed like the better alternative. "I'm ready," Emma said finally, standing up with her duffel bag clutched against her chest like armor. As they walked toward Tommy's truck, he found himself wondering what he'd just committed to. Taking in a stranger was completely unlike him. He'd spent 2 years carefully constructing a life that required nothing from other people and offered them little in return. But something about Emma Caldwell's determined vulnerability had penetrated defenses he'd thought were impenetrable. Loading her single bag into the truck bed, Tommy caught a glimpse of Emma's profile as she settled into the passenger seat. There was something about the way she held herself that suggested she was protecting more than just her dignity. Her hand moved unconsciously to her stomach in a gesture so brief he almost missed it, but it sparked a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. As they drove through Millbrook's main street, heading toward the mountain road that led to his cabin, Tommy found himself stealing glances at his unexpected passenger. Emma sat quietly, taking in the familiar sights of the small logging town with the attention of someone who was memorizing escape routes. "You can change your mind," Tommy said, as they left the town limits behind. "If you decide this isn't what you want, I can bring you back to town any time." Emma turned to look at him fully for the first time since getting in the truck. "Are you having second thoughts about hiring me?" "No," Tommy replied, and realized he meant it. "Just want you to know you're not trapped up there. Whatever brought you to that auction yard, whatever you're dealing with, you've got choices." Something in Emma's expression softened slightly. "Thank you," she said quietly. "That means more than you know." As Tommy's truck climbed the winding mountain road toward his cabin, the December afternoon light beginning to fade through the evergreen canopy, neither of them could have predicted how completely this impulsive decision would transform their carefully guarded lives. What Tommy didn't know was that Emma Caldwell was carrying secrets that would challenge everything he thought he understood about trust, family, and the courage required to start over. What Emma didn't know was that the quiet lumberjack beside her was about to offer her something she'd never experienced before. A place where she could be safe enough to tell the truth about who she really was and what she was protecting. The mountain road stretched ahead of them, leading toward a future neither had planned, but both desperately needed. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe. To our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The dirt road to Tommy's cabin wound through dense stands of Douglas fir and western hemlock, climbing steadily into the Cascade foothills where civilization gave way to wilderness. Emma pressed her face to the passenger window, watching the last traces of human habitation disappear behind walls of evergreen forest. The silence between them felt comfortable rather than awkward, both lost in their own thoughts as the truck navigated switchbacks that grew progressively steeper. "There," Tommy said finally, pointing through a break in the trees. "That's home." Emma's breath caught in her throat. The cabin nestled in a natural clearing like something from a fairy tale, its dark wood siding weathered to a rich patina that blended seamlessly with the surrounding forest. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and wide windows glowed with warm yellow light against the gathering dusk. A covered porch wrapped around 3 sides of the structure, supported by timber columns that looked hand-hewn from local trees. It was nothing like the cramped apartment she'd shared with her sister in Los Angeles, nothing like the sterile hotel rooms where she'd spent the last 2 weeks. This was a place where someone could breathe, where the weight of other people's expectations and judgments couldn't penetrate the protective barrier of ancient trees. "It's beautiful," Emma said softly, and meant it. Tommy seemed surprised by her genuine appreciation. "Built it myself over 3 summers. Well, rebuilt it anyway. The original structure was my grandfather's hunting cabin from the 1940s, but it needed pretty much everything replaced except the foundation." As they climbed out of the truck, Emma was struck by the absolute quiet of the place. No traffic noise, no sirens, no sounds of neighbors arguing through thin walls. Just the whisper of wind through pine needles and the distant call of a hawk circling somewhere high above the canopy. Tommy shouldered her duffel bag and led her up the porch steps, which creaked pleasantly under their weight. The front door was solid oak with hand-forged iron hardware that spoke of craftsmanship rather than mere utility. When Tommy pushed it open, Emma stepped into a space that felt like a refuge from the world. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with exposed beam ceilings that soared to accommodate a stone fireplace dominating the far wall. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows across furniture that was clearly handmade. A dining table crafted from a single massive slab of wood, chairs with seats woven from leather strips, bookcases built into alcoves beside the fireplace. "Kitchens through there," Tommy said, gesturing to an archway that led to what appeared to be a surprisingly modern cooking space. "Bathrooms down the hall, and there's a guest room upstairs that you can use. It's got its own bathroom and plenty of privacy." Emma nodded, taking in details that spoke of a man who valued both solitude and comfort. The walls were lined with books, everything from technical manuals about forestry to classic literature to what appeared to be an extensive collection of history texts. A guitar sat in one corner, its well-worn finish suggesting regular use. The overall effect was masculine, but not aggressively so, welcoming rather than intimidating. "I should probably explain the setup," Tommy continued, settling his large frame into one of the handmade chairs. "I'm usually up before dawn to check equipment and plan the day's work. Breakfast is typically something simple: coffee, eggs, toast. I come back for lunch around noon, unless I'm working a site too far away. Dinner's the main meal, usually around 6. Emma listened carefully, filing away information that would help her navigate this new arrangement successfully. "What would you like me to focus on first?" "Getting settled, mainly. Tomorrow we can go over the household routine and you can see what needs attention. To be honest, I've been letting things slide lately, eating too much takeout from town, letting laundry pile up, basic maintenance that I keep putting off." There was something almost apologetic in his admission, as if he was embarrassed by his own human needs. Emma recognized the feeling, the shame of requiring help, the vulnerability of admitting that isolation sometimes meant neglecting yourself. "I understand," she said simply. "Everyone needs support sometimes." Tommy's green eyes met hers across the warm space, and Emma saw recognition there, the acknowledgement of someone who understood what it meant to carry burdens alone. It was a dangerous moment of connection, the kind that might lead to questions she wasn't ready to answer, to break. The tension, Emma moved toward the kitchen archway. "Mind if I look around? Get familiar with where things are?" "Of course, make yourself at home." The kitchen was indeed modern, with stainless steel appliances and granite countertops that contrasted beautifully with the rustic wood cabinets. A large window over the sink looked out into the forest, where the last light of day was fading between the trees. Emma ran her fingers along the smooth stone surface, noting the quality of everything from the professional grade range to the solid. "Wood-cutting boards. You cook much?" she asked, returning to the main room. "Basic stuff: grilled meat, pasta, sandwiches." My ex-fiancé used to say I had the culinary imagination of a 12-year-old boy. The mention of an ex-fiancé answered some questions while raising others. Emma noted the past tense, the slight tightness around Tommy's eyes when he mentioned her. Another person carrying old wounds, apparently. Well, Emma said carefully, I enjoy cooking. It's one of the things I'm actually good at. What else are you good at? The question was casual, but Emma felt her defenses rise automatically. She'd learned to be careful about revealing too much too quickly, especially to men who offered help. There was usually a price attached even when it wasn't immediately obvious. Numbers, she said finally. I have a degree in accounting from UCLA, worked for a small firm in Los Angeles before. She let the sentence trail off, hoping he wouldn't. Push for details. Tommy nodded without pressing, which surprised her. Most people would have immediately asked what had brought an accountant with a college degree to a lumber auction in rural Oregon. His restraint suggested either exceptional politeness or personal experience with subjects too painful to discuss. That could be useful, he said instead. The business side of logging involves more paperwork than most people realize. Environmental compliance, contracts with mills, equipment maintenance records. I've been handling it myself, but I'm better. With an axe than a spreadsheet. Emma felt some of her tension ease. A legitimate job with clearly defined responsibilities was exactly what she needed. Structure without intrusion, purpose without personal complications. I'd be happy to help. With that, she said, tomorrow, if you want, I can take a look at your current system and see where improvements might be useful. Tommy's expression brightened with genuine interest. You do that? It's what you're paying me for, isn't it? Right, yes, He paused, seeming to search for words. I guess I'm not used to having help, or offering it, for that matter. The admission was surprisingly vulnerable, and Emma found herself responding before she could stop herself. I'm not used to accepting it, so I suppose we'll both be learning. The moment stretched between them, laden with unspoken understanding. Emma realized that whatever had happened to drive Tommy into this mountain isolation, it had left him as wary of human connection as she was. The recognition was both comforting and dangerous. Comforting because it meant he was unlikely to pry into her secrets. Dangerous because shared wounds sometimes created bonds that were difficult to break when the time came to move on. I should show you upstairs, Tommy said, standing and reaching for her duffel bag. The staircase was solid hardwood, each step hand-sanded and finished to a warm honey color. At the top, a short hallway led to two doors, one clearly leading to Tommy's bedroom, the other standing open to reveal the guest space. Emma's room was larger than she'd expected, with a double bed covered in what appeared to be a handmade quilt, a dresser that matched the downstairs furniture, and another stone fireplace, smaller than the one below, but equally well-crafted. Large windows on two walls offered views of the forest that would be spectacular in daylight. There's firewood. Stacked on the back porch, Tommy said, setting her bag on the bed. Gets cold up here at night, even with the main furnace running. The bathroom's through that door. It's all yours. I have my own attached to the master bedroom. Emma nodded, running her hand along the smooth wood of the dresser top. This is beautiful work. Did you make all the furniture? Most of it. Keeps me busy during the winter months when logging slows down. Tommy paused in the doorway, seeming to wrestle with something. Emma, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but you look exhausted. Why don't you get some rest? Tomorrow's soon enough to worry about work arrangements. The kindness in his voice nearly undid her carefully maintained composure. Emma realized that she was indeed exhausted, bone-deep tired in a way that went beyond physical fatigue. The last month had been a series of increasingly desperate decisions, each one narrowing her options, until she'd found herself sitting on that crate at the auction with nowhere left to go. Thank you, she managed. I think I will. After Tommy's footsteps disappeared down the stairs, Emma sank onto the bed and allowed herself to truly exhale for the first time in weeks. The quilt beneath her hands was soft with age and careful. Yews, the kind of family heirloom that spoke of generations of love and continuity. She wondered who had made it, what hands had sewn these careful stitches, what stories this room had witnessed. For a moment, the fear that had become her constant companion quieted enough for her to imagine what it might be like to stay here, to build something resembling a normal life in this peaceful sanctuary. Then reality intruded, as it always did, reminding her that safety was temporary and secrets had a way of surfacing no matter how carefully they were buried. Emma placed her hand protectively over her stomach, feeling the barely perceptible curve that would soon be impossible to hide. In 3 months, maybe 4 if she was lucky, her pregnancy would be obvious to everyone. The twins growing inside her, a fact she'd discovered only 2 weeks ago through a clinic in Sacramento, would change everything, making flight more difficult. And the need for stability more urgent. She'd been 19 weeks along before she'd even known she was pregnant, her irregular periods and stress-related weight loss masking the signs until a bout of severe morning sickness had driven her to seek medical care. The ultrasound image, showing 2 tiny hearts beating in perfect synchronization, had been both terrifying and miraculous, forcing her to confront choices she'd been avoiding. Tommy Brennan seemed like a good man, but Emma had learned not to trust her judgment about men. Her sister had called her naive, trusting, too willing to see the best in people who meant her harm. The evidence suggested Carrie was right. Emma's trust had already been catastrophically misplaced once, with consequences that had driven her to flee everything she'd ever known. But sitting in this handmade room, surrounded by the profound quiet of the mountain forest, Emma allowed herself to hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe she'd found a place where she could catch her breath, save some money, and figure out how to build a life that could accommodate 2 babies who deserved better than a mother running scared from shadows. Downstairs, she could hear Tommy moving. Around the kitchen, the domestic sounds of someone preparing a simple dinner. The normalcy of it was almost overwhelming after weeks of hiding, running, looking over her shoulder for threats that might or might not be real. Emma unpacked her few belongings, hanging her clothes in the cedar-lined closet and placing her toiletries in the spotless bathroom. Everything she owned fit easily into half the available space, a reminder of how completely she'd severed ties with her old life. At the bottom of her duffel bag, wrapped carefully in a towel, was the envelope containing the ultrasound photos and the sparse documentation of her medical history. Emma stared at the grainy images for a long moment, studying the tiny profiles that would become her children, before tucking the envelope into the dresser's bottom drawer. Tomorrow she would begin the careful work of building a new identity, a plausible story that would explain her presence here without revealing the dangers she was fleeing. She would make herself useful, indispensable if possible, buying time to plan for a future that remained frustratingly uncertain. But tonight, for the first time in months, Emma Caldwell would sleep in a real bed, in a room that belonged to no one's nightmares but her own, protected by mountain silence and the unexpected kindness of a stranger who asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer. Emma woke to the sound of an axe biting into wood, a rhythmic splitting that echoed through the mountain air like a heartbeat. Pale December sunlight filtered through the bedroom windows, revealing a landscape transformed by overnight frost that turned every pine needle and blade of grass into crystal sculptures. She'd slept more deeply than she had in weeks, her body finally relaxing enough to accept genuine rest. The digital clock on the nightstand read 7:23 a.m. Through her window, she could see Tommy in the side yard, his powerful frame moving with practiced efficiency as he split logs for the winter supply. He'd clearly been at work for some time, His breath formed clouds in the cold air, and there was already a substantial pile of split wood stacked against the cabin's north wall. Emma dressed quickly in jeans and a thick sweater, then made her way downstairs to find coffee already brewing and the kitchen warm from the wood stove's heat. A plate covered with a dish towel sat on the counter, and when she lifted it, she found 2 perfectly cooked eggs, bacon and buttered toast, still warm, as if Tommy had timed his breakfast preparation to her waking. The thoughtfulness of the gesture caught her off guard. In her experience, men who offered help usually expected immediate gratitude and attention in return. But Tommy had simply left breakfast and continued with his work, asking nothing except her eventual participation in the day's routine. She ate standing at the kitchen window, watching him work. There was something almost meditative about his movements, the careful positioning of each log, the smooth arc of the axe, the precise split that sent wood flying in perfect halves. It spoke of years of practice, of a man who found peace in physical labor and the satisfaction of preparing for winter's challenges. When Tommy finally came inside, stamping snow from his boots and pulling off heavy work gloves, Emma had already washed the breakfast dishes and started examining the pile of paperwork stacked on the kitchen counter. "Morning," he said, pouring himself fresh coffee. "Hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Emma replied honestly. "Thank you for breakfast. You didn't have to do that." Tommy shrugged, his cheeks still red from the cold outdoor work. "Figured you might need some fuel before diving into whatever chaos I've created with the business records." Emma gestured at the papers spread before her. Invoices, receipts, equipment, maintenance logs, environmental compliance forms, all mixed together without apparent organization. "It's not as bad as you think, just needs a system." "You sure about that?" Tommy asked, settling into a chair beside her. "I've been throwing everything into boxes for the past 6 months. My accountant in town keeps threatening to fire me as a client." Emma began sorting the documents into logical categories, her trained eye quickly identifying patterns and priorities. "When's your next quarterly tax filing due?" "January 15th, which is why Peterson, that's my accountant, has been calling twice a week." "We can have this ready for him by New Year's," Emma said confidently, creating separate stacks for income, expenses, equipment purchases, and regulatory compliance. "The key is setting up systems so it doesn't pile up like this again." As she worked, Tommy watched with obvious fascination. "You really know what you're doing." "I spent 3 years cleaning up messes bigger than this for small businesses in LA, Emma replied, then immediately regretted mentioning her past. The fewer details she shared, the easier it would be to maintain her carefully constructed boundaries. But Tommy didn't push for more information. Instead, he stood and refilled both their coffee cups. "I should let you work. I need to check on some equipment down at the logging site anyway." "How far is the site?" Emma asked, partly from genuine curiosity and partly because she was learning to monitor Tommy's movements for her own sense of security. "About 3 miles south, following the old forestry road. I'll be back by noon." Tommy paused, seeming to consider something. "Emma, you should know that cell service up here is spotty at best. If you need to reach me, there's a 2-way radio on the kitchen counter. Just press the button and call for base camp. I'll hear you." The radio was an older model, but well-maintained, its antenna suggesting serious range capability. Emma nodded her understanding, filing away this information as another piece of the safety net she was constantly weaving around herself. After Tommy left, Emma threw herself into organizing his business records with an intensity that surprised her. The work was familiar and comforting, requiring the kind of focused attention that left little room for worry or fear. Numbers didn't lie, didn't manipulate, didn't make promises they couldn't keep. In a world where Emma had learned to question everything, mathematics remained reliably honest. As she worked, patterns emerged that told the story of Tommy's operation. Brennan Logging was small but profitable, serving 3 regional mills with sustainably harvested timber from his grandfather's 800-acre tract. The environmental compliance paperwork showed a commitment to responsible forestry practices that went beyond legal requirements. Selective cutting, wildlife habitat preservation, water quality protection. More interesting were the personal details. Revealed through his financial records, Tommy lived simply with minimal personal expenses beyond basic necessities and equipment maintenance. No restaurant charges, no entertainment expenses, no travel costs beyond occasional trips to Portland for equipment purchases. It was the financial profile of a man who had deliberately simplified his life to the point of near isolation. But there were also charitable donations. Regular contributions to a veterans support organization, monthly payments to something called the Rachel Morrison Memorial Scholarship Fund, and annual gifts to the local volunteer fire department. The pattern suggested someone who cared deeply about community welfare despite his own withdrawal from social connection. Emma found herself wondering about the scholarship fund that bore a woman's name. Given Tommy's mention of an ex-fiancée, it seemed likely that Rachel Morrison had been more than just a past relationship. Perhaps someone whose loss had shaped his retreat to mountain solitude. By the time Tommy returned for lunch, Emma had created a comprehensive filing system and prepared a summary of his fourth-quarter position that would make tax preparation straightforward. She'd also discovered something that made her stomach clench with anxiety. "You've been incredibly productive," Tommy said, examining the neat stacks of organized paperwork. "This looks professional." "There's something we need to discuss," Emma said carefully. "I found some correspondence from the Forest Service about your cutting permits for next year." Tommy's expression grew serious. "Problem?" "They're requiring updated environmental impact assessments for any operations within 2 miles of Salmon Creek. The new regulations went into effect in November, and the deadline for compliance filing is January 31st. "How much is that going to cost?" Emma consulted her notes. "The assessment itself runs about $15,000. But if you don't comply, they can suspend your cutting permits indefinitely. That would essentially shut down your operation." Tommy sank into a chair, running his hands through his dark hair. 15,000. Jesus. I mean, I can cover it, but it'll wipe out most of my cash reserves right before the slow season. Emma watched his face carefully, noting the stress that tightened around his eyes. There might be options. The regulations include provisions for small operators to spread the cost over multiple payment periods. And there are some federal grants available for sustainable forestry operations that maintain wildlife habitat. You know about those programs? I researched them this morning. One of the benefits of having internet access and knowing how to navigate federal databases. Emma pulled out a printed page covered with her neat handwriting. There's a particularly relevant grant program through the Department of Agriculture. Applications are due February 1st, but the potential award is up to $25,000 for operations that meet specific conservation criteria. Tommy studied the information she'd compiled, his expression shifting from stress to cautious optimism. This level of research, Emma, this is way beyond basic bookkeeping. You've essentially conducted a business consultation that would cost me thousands of dollars if I hired a firm in Portland. Emma felt heat rise in her cheeks. She'd gotten carried away, allowing her professional competence to override her intention to remain unremarkable and easily forgotten. I just wanted to be thorough. No, don't apologize. This is incredible work. Tommy looked at her with something approaching awe. But it makes me wonder what you're really doing here. Someone with your skills could be working for major corporations, making serious money. Instead, you're organizing paperwork for a hermit lumberjack in the middle of nowhere. The question Emma had been dreading hung in the air between them. She could feel Tommy's genuine curiosity, his growing respect for her abilities, and underneath it all, the dangerous warmth of someone beginning to care about her as more than just hired help. "Everyone has reasons for the choices they make," Emma said carefully. "Sometimes those reasons are private." Tommy nodded slowly, but she could see him processing her evasion, filing it away with other small mysteries he'd noticed about her. "Fair enough. But Emma, whatever brought you here, I want you to know that this level of help, it means more than you probably realize." The sincerity in his voice made Emma's chest tighten with emotions she couldn't afford to indulge. Gratitude. Yes, but also something more dangerous. The beginning of genuine affection for this quiet man who worked with his hands and asked no questions she wasn't ready to answer. "I should start lunch," she said, standing quickly before the moment could deepen into something more complicated. As Emma busied herself in the kitchen, she was acutely aware of Tommy's presence at the table behind her, the sound of him reviewing her organized paperwork, the occasional grunt of approval as he discovered how much progress she'd made in a single morning. The domestic rhythm felt dangerously normal, like the beginning of a life she could imagine wanting to keep. But normalcy was a luxury Emma couldn't afford. In her experience, the moments when she began to feel safe were exactly when danger revealed itself. Her sister's voice echoed in her memory. "You always think you can trust people, Em, but everyone wants something, and when they don't get it, they turn mean." The babies, she corrected herself, moved for the first time that morning, a flutter so subtle she almost missed it. At 19 weeks, the movement was barely perceptible, but it reminded Emma that her time for making choices was running out. Soon her pregnancy would be obvious, and then all the careful boundaries she was building would crumble under the weight of questions she couldn't answer without revealing truths that might destroy this fragile sanctuary. "Emma," Tommy's voice, pulled her from her worried spiral. "You okay? You've been stirring that soup for 5 minutes without adding anything to it." Emma looked down to find herself mechanically stirring an empty pot, her mind so consumed with future complications that she'd lost track of present reality. "Sorry, just thinking about the grant application requirements." Tommy stood and moved to the stove beside her, close enough that she could smell the clean scent of pine and wood smoke that clung to his clothes. "The grants can wait. Right now, how about we just focus on lunch?" His calm presence was both comforting and unsettling. Emma found herself responding to his steady energy in ways that made her nervous. The urge to lean into his strength, to share burdens she'd been carrying alone, to trust in the possibility that not every man who offered help had ulterior motives. "Tommy," she said suddenly, not sure what she intended to say next. "Yeah." Emma turned to face him, seeing patience in his green eyes, a willingness to wait for whatever she was struggling to express. For a moment, she considered telling him everything, about the pregnancy, about why she'd really fled California, about the fears that followed her even into this mountain sanctuary. Instead, she settled for a smaller truth. "Thank you for giving me a chance. I know hiring a stranger was a risk." Tommy's expression softened with something that might have been understanding. "We're all strangers until someone decides to take that risk. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "seems like the risk is paying off for both of us." As they prepared lunch together in the warm kitchen, Emma allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to build a life here, to raise her children, in this peaceful place, with this good man who asked for nothing more than honest work and mutual respect. It was a dangerous fantasy, but for just a moment she let herself believe it might be possible. Outside, snow began to fall again, wrapping the cabin in another layer of protective isolation. Inside, two wounded people continued the careful dance of building trust, unaware that the foundations they were laying would soon be tested by revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about each other. 3 weeks into January, the mountain routine had settled into something that felt dangerously like contentment. Emma had transformed Tommy's chaotic business records into a streamlined operation, successfully submitted the grant application that could save his logging operation, and established herself as indispensable in ways that went far beyond basic housekeeping. But contentment, she was learning, made her careless. The morning everything changed started like any other. Tommy had left before dawn to repair equipment at the logging site, the two-way radio crackling with his routine check-in at 8 a.m. Emma was alone in the cabin, working on quarterly reports while a winter storm pelted the windows with sleet and snow. The isolation that had once felt protective now seemed to amplify every small sound: the settling of timber, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant crack of trees adjusting to the cold. She was reaching for a file on the high shelf above Tommy's desk when it happened. A sudden wave of dizziness swept over her, followed immediately by nausea so intense she barely made it to the bathroom before being violently sick. When the episode passed, Emma found herself sitting on the cold tile floor, shaking and weak, her body finally rebelling against weeks of careful control. At 22 weeks pregnant with twins, her body was demanding acknowledgement of its condition. The loose sweaters and strategic layering that had hidden her growing belly were becoming inadequate. More concerning, the morning sickness that should have subsided months ago was returning with vengeance, probably triggered by the stress of maintaining her deception. Emma struggled to her feet and caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. Even she could see the changes now. The fuller face, the way her clothes pulled differently across her torso, the exhaustion that lingered despite adequate sleep. How long before Tommy noticed what she was desperately trying to hide? She was splashing cold water on her face when she heard the unmistakable sound of a vehicle approaching the cabin. Through the bathroom window, she could see headlights cutting through the storm, not Tommy's familiar pickup, but a dark sedan that looked completely out of place on the mountain road. Emma's blood turned to ice. She'd been found, moving quickly. She gathered the ultrasound photos and medical records from their hiding place in the dresser drawer, shoving them into her jacket pocket. Through the front window, she watched two figures emerge from the sedan, a man in an expensive coat and a woman in professional attire, both looking around the clearing with the systematic attention of people conducting a search. The knock-on. The door was firm and authoritative. "Emma Caldwell, we know you're in there. We just want to talk." Emma pressed herself against the wall beside the window, mind racing through possibilities. How had they found her? She'd been so careful, paying cash for everything, avoiding social media, using only the most basic cell phone for emergencies. But somehow, her sister's threats had proven more than empty words. "Emma, this is Detective Lisa Chen with the Los Angeles Police Department," the woman's voice called through the door. "We need to discuss some serious allegations that have been made against you." The official tone made Emma's situation crystal clear. Carrie had actually gone through with it, filed whatever charges she'd been threatening for months, probably related to the money Emma had taken when she fled California. Money that had belonged to both of them from their parents' estate, but which Carrie claimed had been stolen. Emma knew she had two choices: face whatever legal nightmare her sister had constructed, or run again with even fewer resources and options than before. Neither choice accounted for the twins she was carrying or the life she'd begun to build in this mountain sanctuary. The radio on the kitchen counter crackled to life. "Base camp, this is Tommy. Roads completely washed out about a mile down from the cabin. Going to be at least 2 hours before I can get back up there. Everything okay?" Emma looked at the radio, then at the door where two people waited with handcuffs and questions she couldn't answer without destroying everything. In a split second, she made a decision that surprised even her. She keyed the radio. "Tommy, we have visitors. Police from Los Angeles. I think you should know that my name might not actually be Emma Caldwell." The silence that followed stretched long enough for Emma to wonder if the radio connection had failed. Then Tommy's voice came back, carefully controlled but unmistakably concerned. "Are you safe right now?" "I think so, but Tommy, there are things I haven't told you. Important things. We'll sort it out when I get there. Don't open the door until I'm back, understand?" The authority in his voice was comforting, but Emma knew that protection might evaporate once he learned the truth about who she really was and why she was running. "Ma'am?" Detective Chen called again. "We can see lights inside, and we know you're listening. This will be easier if you cooperate voluntarily." Emma approached the door slowly, her hand trembling as she turned the deadbolt. "I'm here," she called, through the thick wood, "but I'm not opening the door until Tommy gets back." "Tommy Brennan?" The male voice sounded amused. "The Lumberjack? Ma'am, Mr. Brennan can't help you with federal charges." Federal charges. Emma's legs nearly gave out beneath her. Whatever Carrie had set in motion was worse than she'd imagined. "What federal charges?" Emma asked, though she was terrified of the answer. "Interstate transportation of stolen property," Detective Chen replied. "Wire fraud, identity theft. Your sister has provided extensive documentation of your criminal activities over the past 6 months. Each charge hit Emma like a physical blow. Carrie had been thorough, probably working with her lawyer boyfriend to construct a case that would force Emma back to California, where she could be controlled and manipulated. The stolen property was undoubtedly the inheritance money Emma had taken, legally hers, but which Carrie could probably claim was accessed improperly. The wire fraud and identity theft charges were more mysterious, but Emma suspected they related to the false information she'd used to establish her new identity. "I want to speak with the lawyer," Emma said through the door. "That's your right," the male officer replied. "But federal warrants don't go away because you hide in the mountains. We're prepared to wait." Emma sank into one of Tommy's handmade chairs, her hand instinctively moving to protect her growing belly. Everything she'd built here, the safety, the purpose, the growing connection with Tommy, was about to be destroyed by her past. Worse, the twins would be born in custody, their first experiences of the world shaped by whatever punishment Carrie had arranged for their mother. The next hour passed in surreal slow motion. Emma could hear the officers moving around outside, probably examining Tommy's property and discussing strategy. Snow continued to fall, turning the cabin into an island surrounded by white silence and legal threats. When Tommy's truck finally appeared through the storm, Emma felt a mixture of relief and dread. He would protect her if he could, but once he learned about the pregnancy and the criminal charges, would he still want to? Tommy entered the cabin like a force of nature, snow melting off his shoulders and determination radiating from every line of his body. He took in Emma's pale face and trembling hands, then moved to the window to assess the situation outside. "How? And many?" he asked quietly. "2. Detective Chen from LAPD and another officer. They have federal warrants." Tommy nodded grimly. "What aren't you telling me, Emma?" The moment of truth had arrived. Emma looked into his steady green eyes and made another decision that surprised her. She chose complete honesty. "My real name is Emma Hartwell. I took money from a joint account I shared with my sister when I left California. Money that was legally mine, but which she's claiming was stolen. I used false information to get the job with you because I was afraid she'd track me down." Tommy absorbed this information without visible judgment. "What else?" Emma's hand moved, unconsciously to her stomach. "I'm pregnant, 22 weeks, with twins." The silence that followed was deafening. Emma watched Tommy's face carefully, noting the moment when surprise shifted to calculation, then to something that might have been hurt. Twins. he repeated slowly. I found out just before I came here. I was going to tell you, but I was afraid. Emma's voice broke. I was afraid you'd send me away. Tommy moved to the window again, studying the officers who waited patiently in their sedan. When he turned back to Emma, his expression was unreadable. Emma, or Hartwell, whoever you are, those babies you're carrying, are they safe? Are you taking care of them? The question wasn't what Emma had expected. Yes, I've been to a doctor. They're healthy. And the father? Emma's face darkened. Not in the picture. Won't ever be in the picture. Tommy nodded once, decisively. Then here's what we're going to do. You're going to walk out there and surrender yourself, because running only makes things worse. But you're not going alone. Tommy, you don't understand. If they arrest me, I could spend years in prison. The babies will be fine. Tommy interrupted with quiet authority, because I'm calling my lawyer and we're going to fight. Whatever your sister has cooked up. And when this is over, if you want to come back here, you'll have a place to come back to. Emma stared at him in disbelief. You'd do that? Even knowing that I lied to you about everything? Tommy was quiet for a long moment, studying her face with the same careful attention he brought to evaluating timber. Emma, I've watched you work for 3 weeks. I've seen how you treat everything in this house with respect, how you've improved. My business, how you've never once asked for anything you didn't earn. Someone who does all that doesn't suddenly become a criminal because her sister files paperwork. The simple faith in his voice nearly broke Emma's carefully maintained composure. What if you're wrong? What if I really am everything they say? I am? Then I'm a poor judge of character, Tommy replied, but I don't think I am. Outside, Detective Chen was growing impatient. Miss Hartwell, we need to resolve this situation. Please open the door. Tommy squeezed Emma's shoulder gently. You ready? Emma looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary, memorizing details she might never see again, the handmade furniture, the warm light from the fireplace, the sense of safety she'd found in this mountain retreat. Then she looked at Tommy, this good man who was offering to fight for her, despite barely knowing who she really was. I'm ready, she said, and meant it, as Tommy unlocked the door and Emma stepped outside to face the consequences of her desperate choices. Neither of them could have predicted how this moment would transform both their lives in ways they never could have imagined. The real test of their fragile trust was just beginning. The Multnomah County Jail in Portland was a stark contrast to the peaceful mountain cabin Emma had called home for 3 weeks. Gray concrete walls, fluorescent lighting that never dimmed, and the constant noise of voices, footsteps, and slamming doors created a sensory assault that left her feeling raw and exposed. But the worst part wasn't the environment, it was the waiting. 3 days had passed since her arrest, 3 days of intake processing, medical evaluations, and meetings with overworked public defenders who spoke in legal jargon and treated her like just another case file. The pregnancy had been discovered immediately during the mandatory medical screening, adding another layer of complexity to her situation and landing her in a special housing unit for vulnerable inmates. Emma sat on the narrow bunk in her cell, reading over the charges for the 100th time, trying to understand how her sister had managed to construct such an elaborate legal nightmare. The federal prosecutor had been thorough: interstate transportation of stolen property, wire fraud for using false information to secure employment, and identity theft for creating fake references. Each charge carried potential prison time that would ensure her children were born in custody and raised in foster care. Hartwell, a guard called from the cell door. You've got visitors. Emma's heart lurched. She'd been dreading this moment. The inevitable confrontation with Carrie and her lawyer boyfriend, coming to gloat over their successful trap. But when she entered the visiting room, she found Tommy sitting at one of the metal tables, his large frame looking incongruous in the institutional setting. Beside him sat a woman in her 50s with silver hair and sharp eyes, wearing an expensive suit that marked her as serious legal counsel. "Emma," Tommy said, standing as she approached. His green eyes were full of concern and something else, determination. "This is Margaret Foster. She's agreed to represent you." Margaret Foster extended a firm handshake. "Ms. Hartwell, I've reviewed the charges against you, and I have some questions. But first, I want you to know that I specialize in cases involving domestic abuse and financial manipulation. Tommy has filled me in on some background, but I need to hear your version of events." Emma sank into the plastic chair across from them, noting how Tommy's presence made even this sterile room feel less threatening. "I'm not sure where to start." "Start with your sister," Margaret said, pulling out a digital recorder. "Tell me about your relationship with Carrie." For the next hour, Emma found herself recounting details she'd tried to forget. Carrie was 4 years older and had always been the dominant personality in their family. Beautiful, charismatic, but with a cruel streak that emerged whenever she didn't get her way. After their parents died in a car accident 2 years ago, Carrie had taken control of the estate proceedings, convincing Emma that she was too emotionally fragile to handle financial decisions. The inheritance was supposed to be split equally, Emma explained. $200,000 each plus the house, but Carrie convinced me to put everything in a joint account temporarily for easier management while we dealt with probate. Margaret nodded, making notes. And then? Then she met Derek Paulson, this lawyer who specialized in estate planning. Suddenly Carrie was talking about investment opportunities, saying we needed to be smart about our money. But every time I asked questions or wanted to access my portion, she'd get angry, tell me I was being paranoid and ungrateful. Tommy leaned forward. "What happened to make you finally leave?" Emma's hand moved instinctively to her stomach. "I found out I was pregnant. When I told Carrie, she said some terrible things. Called me irresponsible, said I was too stupid to raise children. She wanted me to end the pregnancy. When I refused, she threatened to have me declared mentally incompetent so she could control my portion of the inheritance indefinitely." Margaret's expression sharpened. She threatened guardianship proceedings. Derek had already drawn up papers. They were going to claim I was having a psychological breakdown due to the pregnancy, that I couldn't make rational financial decisions. They had found a psychiatrist willing to evaluate me, probably paid him to reach the conclusion they wanted. "So you took your half of the inheritance and left," Tommy said. "I took what was legally mine," Emma corrected. "But I did it secretly, transferring the funds to a new account and closing our joint accounts before they could stop me. I knew they'd call it theft, but I didn't know they'd involve federal authorities." Margaret was typing rapidly on her laptop. "Emma, do you have any documentation that proves your ownership of those funds? Bank statements, the will, anything that shows the money was yours?" Emma shook her head miserably. "Everything was in Carrie's apartment. I was so focused on getting away that I didn't think about gathering evidence." "That's okay," Margaret said, firmly. "We'll subpoena the records. And if what you're telling me is true, these charges won't hold up in court. Wire fraud requires intent to defraud, but you were accessing your own money. Identity theft requires using someone else's personal information for gain. But creating a work history doesn't qualify if you actually performed the work you were hired for." Emma felt a spark of hope for the first time since her arrest. "You don't think the charges will be dropped? I think your sister overplayed her hand," Margaret replied. "Federal prosecutors don't like having their time wasted with what amounts to a family financial dispute, but we need to move quickly. The longer you're in custody, the more complicated this becomes with your pregnancy." Tommy had been quiet during most of the legal discussion, but now he spoke up. "What about bail? Can we get her out while this gets sorted out?" Margaret consulted her notes. The prosecutor is arguing that Emma is a flight risk because she's already fled across state lines once. But given her pregnancy and the questionable nature of the charges, I think we can make a case for supervised release. What kind of supervision? Emma asked. House arrest, probably. Electronic monitoring. You'd need a stable address where the court could be confident you'd remain until trial. Tommy didn't hesitate. She can stay at my cabin. I'll vouch for her. Emma stared at him in disbelief. Tommy, you barely know me, and now you know I lied about who I was. Why would you take that risk? Tommy's green eyes met hers steadily. Because I've had 3 days to think about everything you told me, and I keep coming back to the same conclusion. Someone who reorganizes a stranger's entire business, applies for grants to save his operation, and cooks dinner every night without being asked isn't a criminal. You're someone who was scared and running from people who were trying to control you. Margaret looked between them with obvious interest. Mr. Brennan, you understand that vouching for Ms. Hartwell means you'd be legally responsible if she violated the terms of her release. I understand, Tommy replied without wavering. And Emma, Margaret continued, you need to understand that accepting supervised release means no contact with your sister, no access to any contested funds, and no leaving the property without court permission. Are you prepared for that level of restriction? Emma thought about the alternative. Months in jail while pregnant with twins, giving birth in custody, possibly losing her children to the foster system while legal proceedings dragged on. The choice was obvious. Yes, she said firmly. I can accept those terms. The bail hearing was scheduled for the following morning. As Emma was escorted back to her cell, she carried with her something she hadn't felt since her arrest. Hope. Not just for her legal situation, but for something deeper. Tommy had seen her at her worst, pregnant, lying about her identity, facing serious criminal charges, and he'd chosen to stand by her anyway. That night, lying on the narrow jail bunk, with her hands pressed protectively over her growing belly, Emma whispered to the twins she was carrying, "Hold on, babies. We might have found someone who's going to help us build the life you deserve." The next morning brought another surprise. As Emma was led into the courtroom for her bail hearing, she spotted a familiar figure in the gallery, Carrie, looking perfectly composed in an expensive dress suit, sitting beside a man who could only be Derek Paulson. But what shocked Emma was the look on her sister's face when their eyes met across the courtroom. Instead of triumph, Carrie looked almost nervous. Margaret had warned Emma that federal prosecutors took a dim view of what they considered domestic disputes dressed up as criminal cases. As the prosecutor began presenting his arguments for keeping Emma in custody, it became clear that Margaret's assessment was accurate. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the defendant has demonstrated a clear pattern of deception and flight risk. She assumed a false identity, crossed state lines to avoid the consequences of her actions, and has shown no remorse for her criminal behavior." Margaret rose for the defense. "Your Honor, the prosecution is mischaracterizing what amounts to a family dispute over jointly held inheritance funds. Ms. Hartwell took money that was legally hers from accounts she had every right to access. The so-called identity theft consists of creating work references to escape what she reasonably believed was an attempt to have her declared mentally incompetent by family members seeking to control her inheritance." The judge, an elderly woman, with keen eyes, looked over the case file with obvious skepticism. "Miss Foster, these are serious federal charges. Wire fraud and identity theft aren't typically associated with family financial disputes." "No, Your Honor, which is why I've filed a motion to dismiss all charges. The prosecution cannot demonstrate intent to defraud when the defendant was accessing her own funds. Moreover, we have evidence that the complainant was attempting to manipulate guardianship proceedings to gain control of Ms. Hartwell's portion of their joint inheritance." Emma watched the judge's expression shift as Margaret presented bank records. that Tommy had somehow helped her obtain. Documents showing the original inheritance split and Carrie's subsequent attempts to restrict Emma's access to her own money. The evidence painted a picture very different from the one Carrie and Derek had constructed. "Ms. Hartwell," the judge said finally, "you are released on your own recognizance with electronic monitoring. You will reside at the address provided by your counsel and have no contact with your sister or any contested financial accounts. Any violation of these terms will result in immediate arrest and detention until trial." As the judge's gavel fell, Emma felt tears of relief streaming down her face. She was going home, to the mountain cabin that had become more of a sanctuary than anywhere she'd ever lived, to the man who had risked his own stability to give her a chance at freedom. But as she glanced back at Carrie's shocked face in the gallery, Emma realized that her sister's legal assault had failed to achieve its intended goal. Instead of forcing Emma back under her control, it had driven her into the arms of someone who offered protection without possession, support without strings attached. The real battle for Emma's future was just beginning, but for the first time. Since fleeing California, she wasn't facing it alone. The electronic ankle monitor felt heavier than its actual weight as Emma settled back into the mountain cabin that had become both sanctuary and prison. The device's soft beeping reminded her every few hours that her freedom was conditional, monitored by computers that tracked her every movement within the 5-acre perimeter the court had approved. But after 3 days in county jail, even restricted, freedom felt like a miracle. Tommy had spent the drive from Portland in comfortable silence, occasionally glancing at Emma's profile as she stared out at the familiar mountain landscape. Now, as they stood in the cabin's main room, the space that had felt so natural just days before carried an undercurrent of uncertainty. Everything had changed. The lies were exposed, the pregnancy was known, and their relationship had transformed. From employer-employee to something neither of them quite knew how to define. "The court investigator will be here tomorrow morning to set up the monitoring system," Tommy said, hanging his coat on the wooden peg by the door. "After that, we should have more privacy." Emma nodded, her hand unconsciously moving to her stomach. At 23 weeks, the twins were making their presence known, with increasingly frequent movement. Reminders that time was running out to establish stability before their arrival. "Tommy, I need you to know that you can change your mind about this arrangement. The court would find somewhere else for me to stay." Tommy turned from the fireplace, where he'd been building up the fire. "Emma, are you asking me to change my mind?" "No," she admitted quietly, "but I'm giving you the chance. You've already done more than anyone had a right to expect." "Then stop giving me chances I don't want," Tommy replied with gentle firmness. "You're here because I want you here. The babies you're carrying deserve stability, and you deserve someone in your corner who isn't being paid to care about what happens to you." The reference to Margaret Foster's legal fees brought a flush of embarrassment to Emma's cheeks. The attorney's retainer alone was more than Emma had earned in 3 months of legitimate work, money that Tommy had advanced without hesitation when she'd admitted her savings were frozen pending the court case. "I will pay you back," Emma said. "Every penny of the legal fees plus interest." Tommy waved off her concern. "When this is over and you get access to your inheritance, we'll figure out the money. Right now, I'm more worried about making sure you and the babies stay healthy." As if responding to his words, one of the twins chose that moment to deliver a particularly strong kick, causing Emma to gasp and press her hand more firmly against her side. Tommy's attention sharpened immediately. "You okay? Should I call the doctor?" Emma managed to smile. "I'm fine. They're just getting stronger. At 23 weeks, they're supposed to be more active." Tommy looked fascinated and slightly terrified. "How big are they now?" "About the size of large mangoes, according to the pregnancy app." But since there are two of them... Emma paused, realizing this was the first real conversation they'd had, about the practical realities of her pregnancy. Tommy, you need to understand what you're signing up for. Twins often come early. I could go into labor any time after 34 weeks, which is only 11 weeks away. And when they arrive, everything changes. Sleep schedules, noise levels, the amount of help I'll need. Tommy sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. Emma, can I ask you something personal? More personal than what you already... No, the father. I know you said he's not in the picture, but is he going to show up at some point? Try to claim parental rights? Emma's face darkened, with an emotion Tommy couldn't quite identify. Anger, fear, disgust, all mixed together. No, he doesn't know about the pregnancy, and he never will if I can help it. But legally, he has no rights, because I'll never put his name on the birth certificate. Emma's voice carried a finality that suggested this wasn't open for discussion. The twins will be better off never knowing him. Tommy sensed dangerous territory, but pressed gently forward. Emma, I'm not trying to pry, but if there's any chance he could cause problems... There's not. Emma's tone brooked no argument. He was a mistake. A terrible mistake that I'm not going to compound by letting him anywhere near my children. The pain in her voice told Tommy more than her words did. Whatever had happened with the twins' father, it had been traumatic enough. To drive Emma across the country while pregnant and broke, another piece of the puzzle that explained why she'd been so desperate, so willing to take risks that most people would consider unthinkable. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching vehicle. Through the window, they could see a Jeep Cherokee navigating the mountain road, moving with the confidence of someone familiar with the terrain. That's my neighbor, Jake Morrison, Tommy said, frowning. He doesn't usually come up here without calling first. Jake Morrison turned out to be a man in his 40s with graying hair and the weathered face of someone who spent his life outdoors. He emerged from the Jeep carrying a manila envelope and wearing an expression of serious concern. Tommy, Jake said as he climbed the porch steps, we need to talk. You too, Miss Hartwell. Emma's blood chilled. How do you know my name? Because I've been getting visits from people asking questions about you, private investigators, claiming to be working for your family. Jake handed Tommy the envelope. One of them left this, said you should see what kind of person you're harboring. Tommy opened the envelope and pulled out a collection of photographs and documents. Emma caught glimpses of images that made her stomach clench. Photos of her taken without her knowledge, bank records, and what appeared to be a psychiatric evaluation report she'd never seen before. They're not just trying to get you sent back to California, Jake continued. They're building a case to have you declared mentally incompetent. That report is from a psychiatrist who claims you're suffering from severe postpartum depression and psychosis. That's impossible, Emma protested. I've never been evaluated by any psychiatrist, and I'm not even postpartum yet. Tommy was scanning the documents with growing anger. This evaluation is dated 3 weeks ago, while Emma was here working for me. How could she have been seen by a doctor in Los Angeles? Jake's expression was grim. Because it's fake. The psychiatrist exists. But according to my contacts in law enforcement, he's known for providing evaluations that support whatever his clients want them to say. Your sister and her lawyer friend are trying to build a case that you abandoned your responsibilities because of mental illness, not because you were fleeing financial manipulation. Emma sank into a chair, the full scope of Carrie's strategy becoming clear. If they can prove I'm mentally incompetent, they can challenge my right to make decisions about the inheritance, the pregnancy, everything. There's more, Jake said reluctantly. They've been contacting local social services, claiming that you're an unfit mother who's isolated yourself with strangers who can't provide proper prenatal care. They're laying groundwork to have the children removed when they're born. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire. Emma felt the walls closing in around her, her sister's reach extending even into this mountain sanctuary. Gary wasn't just trying to reclaim control of the inheritance, she was systematically destroying Emma's ability to make any independent choices about her future or her children's welfare. "There's something else you should know," Jake continued. "I'm not just a neighbor. I'm a retired FBI agent, and I've been watching this situation develop with professional interest. What your sister is doing goes beyond a family dispute. It's organized harassment with the intent to manipulate legal proceedings." Tommy looked surprised. "You never mentioned being FBI." "Most people don't need to know, but this case has elements that could constitute federal crimes if we can prove coordination between the false psychiatric report, the private investigators, and the bogus charges. I've been in contact with some former colleagues who are very interested in patterns of psychological manipulation disguised as mental health intervention." Emma felt a spark of hope mixed with fear. "What does that mean, practically?" "It means you might have allies you didn't know about," Jake replied. "But it also means you're dealing with people who are more sophisticated and dangerous than typical family conflicts. They're not just trying to control your money, they're trying to control your ability to resist them." Tommy stood up, pacing to the window where he could see the late afternoon light filtering through the pine trees. "What do we do?" "First, we document everything," Jake said. "Every contact, every threat, every false document they produce. Second, we build a counter-narrative that shows Emma's competence and stability. Third, we prepare for the possibility that this escalates beyond civil and criminal court into federal investigation territory." Emma looked around the cabin that had become her refuge, realizing that her fight was just beginning. But for the first time since fleeing California, she wasn't facing her sister's machinations alone. Tommy had chosen to stand by her, despite learning about her deception and pregnancy. Margaret Foster was fighting the legal battle with professional competence, and now Jake Morrison was offering resources and expertise she hadn't known existed. "Why? Are you helping me?" Emma asked Jake directly. "You don't know me any better than Tommy did when he hired me." Jake's expression softened slightly. "Because I've seen what organized psychological manipulation can do to innocent people, and because I have a daughter about your age who I'd want someone to help if she was in your situation." As the three of them sat in the warm cabin, planning strategy and sharing information, Emma felt something she hadn't experienced since her parents' death. The security of being part of a team. Not people who wanted to control or use her, but allies who respected her autonomy while offering genuine support. The twins chose that moment to remind everyone of their presence with a series of strong kicks that made Emma gasp and laugh simultaneously. "They're excited," she said, noting how both men looked concerned until she smiled. "It's a good thing. Active babies are healthy babies." Tommy moved closer, his eyes drawn to the obvious movement beneath Emma's sweater. Is it okay if—" Emma guided his large hand to the spot where one of the twins was stretching, watching his face transform with wonder as he felt the strong movement beneath his palm. "That's your first introduction to the Hartwell twins," she said softly. "They're strong," Tommy murmured, his voice filled with awe. "They'll need to be," Emma replied, thinking about the battles that lay ahead. "But I think they're going to have the right people looking out for them." Outside, snow began to fall again, wrapping the cabin in another layer of protective isolation. Inside, three adults continued planning for a future that none of them could have imagined just weeks before. A future where an abandoned pregnant woman and a lonely lumberjack might build something stronger than either had thought possible, defended by unexpected allies against forces determined to tear it apart. The real fight for Emma's freedom and her children's future was about to begin, but she was no longer facing it alone. February arrived with a blizzard that buried the mountain. Cabin under 3 feet of snow, effectively cutting off the outside world for nearly a week. Emma found herself grateful for the isolation as her pregnancy became impossible to hide. At 26 weeks, the twins had grown large enough that even her loosest clothes couldn't disguise her condition. The forced confinement also meant no court check-ins, no visits from investigators, and no reminders of the legal battle waiting beyond the white cocoon that surrounded their mountain sanctuary. Tommy had adapted to sharing his space with remarkable grace, making room for Emma's growing needs without making her feel like a burden. He'd moved his home office upstairs to give her privacy on the main floor, rearranged furniture to accommodate her changing mobility, and somehow anticipated her needs before she voiced them. But it was the small gestures that touched her most. The way he'd built up the fire before she woke each morning, how he'd started keeping ginger tea stocked for her occasional nausea, the careful way he'd baby-proofed sharp corners and loose rugs without making it obvious. What Emma hadn't expected was how domestic intimacy would develop between them. Not romantic intimacy, though she was increasingly aware of the attraction simmering beneath their careful friendship, but the deeper intimacy of shared daily life. Tommy had seen her at her most vulnerable, had held her hair back during a particularly bad bout of morning sickness, had driven through a snowstorm to get her to an emergency prenatal appointment when she'd experienced cramping that turned out to be round ligament pain. It was during one of these quiet domestic moments that Emma finally decided to tell him the truth about the twins' father. They were sitting by the fire after dinner, Tommy reading a forestry journal while Emma worked on knitting baby blankets. A skill she'd taught herself from YouTube videos during the long, snowy days. The repetitive motion of the needles was soothing, and the growing pile of soft yellow and green squares gave her a sense of preparing for her children's arrival in tangible ways. "Tommy," she said suddenly, setting down her knitting, "I need to tell you about the baby's father." Tommy looked up from his magazine, his expression carefully neutral. "You don't owe me any explanations, Emma." "Yes, I do. You're risking everything to help me, and you deserve to know what you might be dealing with." Tommy closed the magazine and gave her his full attention. "Okay, I'm listening." Emma took a deep breath, steeling herself for a conversation she'd been avoiding since arriving at the cabin. "His name is Derek Paulson, Carrie's boyfriend, the lawyer helping her with the legal case against me." The silence that followed was profound. Tommy's face went through several expressions: surprise, anger, understanding, and finally a grim recognition that explained much about Emma's desperation to flee California. "Jesus, Emma," Tommy said finally. "He's your sister's boyfriend?" "Was. I think they're still together, but what happened between us? It wasn't a relationship, it was—" Emma struggled to find words that could adequately describe the betrayal and manipulation she'd experienced. "Derek was always around when Carrie was managing the estate. He'd offered to help me understand the legal documents, suggest we meet privately, to go over paperwork, so I wouldn't feel stupid asking questions in front of Carrie." Tommy's jaw tightened as he began to understand the scope of the manipulation Emma had endured. I was grieving, overwhelmed, grateful for his attention. He made me feel like he was the only one who understood how lost I felt after my parents died. Emma's voice grew quieter. It started with dinners to discuss estate business, then progressed to him saying I needed emotional support, that Carrie was too controlling, that he could help me become more independent. "He groomed you," Tommy said bluntly. Emma nodded, tears threatening. "I was so stupid. I actually thought he cared about me, that maybe Carrie and I could both be happy, but it was all calculated. He was gathering information about my emotional state, my decision-making abilities, documenting everything for future use against me." "When did you realize what was happening?" When I found out I was pregnant and told him, he went completely cold, said it was my responsibility to handle the situation, and that if I told Carrie, he'd deny everything ever happened. He said no, one would believe me over him, and that my emotional instability was already a concern to everyone who knew me. Tommy stood up and began pacing, his anger evident in every line of his body. So when you wouldn't get an abortion, he and your sister decided to have you declared mentally incompetent. Exactly. Everything that's happened since, the fake psychiatric reports, the criminal charges, the threats to take the babies, it's all designed to punish me for refusing to disappear quietly. Emma wiped away tears that had finally spilled over. The worst part is that he's probably convinced Carrie that he's protecting her from my instability. She genuinely believes she's saving me from myself. Tommy stopped pacing and crouched in front of Emma's chair, taking her hands in his large, calloused ones. Emma, listen to me. What Derek did to you, taking advantage of your grief, manipulating you while you were vulnerable, using your trust to gather ammunition against you. That's not your fault. That's predatory behavior by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. But I should have seen through it. You were 24 years old, grieving your parents, dealing with complex legal issues you'd never encountered before. He's a lawyer who specializes in manipulation. The power imbalance was enormous. Emma looked into Tommy's steady green eyes and saw no judgment, only anger on her behalf and determination to protect her from further harm. You don't think less of me for being so naive. I think you survived something that would have broken a lot of people. And I think Derek Paulson has no idea what he's awakened by threatening your children. Before Emma could respond, the satellite phone on Tommy's kitchen counter began ringing, the emergency communication device that worked even when regular cell service was blocked by weather. Tommy answered with growing concern as he recognized Margaret Foster's voice. "Margaret, what's wrong?" "Tommy, I need to speak with Emma immediately. We've had a major development in the case." Emma took the phone with trembling hands. "Margaret, what's happened?" "Emma, I've been contacted by the FBI. Jake Morrison's former colleagues have been investigating the network of fraudulent psychiatric evaluations and discovered something significant. Derek Paulson and your sister aren't just targeting you. They're part of a larger scheme that's been operating for at least 3 years. Emma sank back into her chair, the implications hitting her like a physical blow. "What kind of scheme?" "Financial exploitation of vulnerable women, specifically those who've inherited significant assets. The pattern is always the same. Psychological manipulation followed by fraudulent competency evaluations that allow the perpetrators to gain control of their victims' finances. You're victim number 7 that they've identified so far." Tommy had moved close enough to hear Margaret's words, his expression growing darker with each revelation. "The good news is that this makes Derek's behavior toward you part of a federal racketeering case," Margaret continued. "The bad news is that desperate people do desperate things when they realize they're being investigated. I need you both to be extremely careful until we can arrange additional protection." "What kind of protection?" Tommy asked. "Federal marshals, possibly. The FBI believes Derek and Carrie might attempt direct intervention to prevent you from testifying. Emma, your pregnancy makes you particularly vulnerable. If anything happened to you or the babies, it would eliminate the most credible witness against their operation." Emma's hand moved protectively to her stomach, where the twins were moving, restlessly, as if sensing her distress. "How long before the investigation is complete?" "Months, potentially. But Emma, there's something else. The FBI wants to offer you a deal. Full immunity in exchange for cooperation with their investigation. It would mean all charges against you would be dropped, but you'd need to testify against Derek and potentially other members of the network." Emma looked at Tommy, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his face. This was the opportunity they'd been hoping for, a chance to not only clear her name, but to stop Derek from victimizing other women. But it also meant months of living as a potential target, carrying twins who would be born into a world where their mother was marked for retaliation by dangerous people. "I need time to think," Emma said finally. "You have 24 hours, Margaret replied. "The FBI wants an answer before they proceed with arrests. And Emma, whatever you decide, make sure you're prepared for the consequences. These people have already shown they're willing to destroy lives to protect their operation." After ending the call, Emma and Tommy sat in silence, the weight of the decision settling over them like another layer of snow. Outside, the blizzard continued to rage, but inside the cabin, Emma felt the fragile safety they'd built beginning to crack under the pressure of choices that would determine not just her future, but the future of her unborn children. "What are you thinking?" Tommy asked quietly. Emma looked around the cabin that had become more of a home than anywhere she'd ever lived. At the man who had risked everything to give her sanctuary. At the baby blankets she'd been knitting in preparation for a future that suddenly seemed uncertain again. "I'm thinking that I'm tired of running," she said finally. "These babies deserve a mother who fights for them, not one who hides from the truth." Tommy reached for her hand. "Whatever you decide, you're not fighting alone." Emma squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from his unwavering support. "Then I guess we'd better call Margaret back. The FBI is going to get their witness." As snow continued to fall outside, wrapping their mountain sanctuary in temporary protection, Emma Hartwell prepared to face the most dangerous choice of her life, standing up to the people who had tried to destroy her, for the sake of children who deserved a world where predators couldn't hide behind professional credentials and family loyalty. The real battle was about to begin, but this time, Emma would be fighting back. The courthouse in Portland buzzed with controlled chaos as federal prosecutors prepared for what had become the largest financial exploitation case in Oregon's recent history. Emma sat in the witness preparation room, her hands resting on her now enormous belly, watching her reflection in the window that overlooked the city. At 34 weeks pregnant with twins, she looked like she was carrying a basketball under her maternity dress. A dress that Tommy had driven to 3 different stores to find when she'd realized none of her clothes would work for federal court testimony. 6 months had passed since she'd agreed to cooperate with the FBI investigation. 6 months of depositions, evidence gathering, and living under federal protection that had transformed Tommy's mountain cabin into a fortress monitored by marshals who rotated shifts like guardian angels in tactical gear. But today was the culmination of everything. Derek Paulson's trial, where Emma would finally face the man who had manipulated her grief into a weapon against herself. "You ready for this?" Tommy asked, settling into the chair beside her with the careful attention he'd developed for her comfort during the final weeks of pregnancy. His presence had become her anchor during the months of legal proceedings, the steady constant that reminded her she wasn't alone in this fight. As ready as someone can be who's about to give birth any day and testify against the father of her children, Emma replied with a wry smile that didn't quite hide her nervousness. Tommy reached for her hand, his calloused fingers intertwining with hers in a gesture that had become automatic between them. Over the past months, their relationship had deepened in ways that surprised them both. What had started as employer and employee had evolved through crisis into something that felt unshakable, not just romantic love, though that had grown slowly and carefully between them, but the deeper bond of 2 people who had chosen to build something together from the wreckage of their separate traumas. "Emma, you know you don't have to do this if you're not feeling up to it," Tommy said quietly. "The prosecutors have enough evidence from the other victims to convict him without your testimony." "No," Emma said firmly, feeling one of the twins shift position as if responding to her determination. These babies deserve to know that their mother stood up for what was right, even when it was hard, and Derek needs to understand that he can't. Destroy women's lives without consequences. The door opened to admit Margaret Foster, looking professional and confident in her navy suit. Behind her came Agent Sarah Chen, Jake Morrison's former colleague who had become the lead investigator on the case. Both women had become more than professional allies over the past months. They'd become friends who understood the stakes of what Emma was risking. "How are you feeling?" Margaret asked, noting the way Emma shifted uncomfortably in her chair. "Like I'm carrying 2 watermelons and haven't slept properly in weeks," Emma admitted. "But determined. Is Derek here?" Agent Chen nodded grimly. "He's in holding. His lawyer is trying to delay the proceedings, claiming his client needs more time to prepare, but Judge Martinez isn't having it. This case goes to the jury today." Emma took a deep breath, centering herself for what was to come. The past 6 months had revealed the full scope of Derek and Carrie's operation, a sophisticated scheme that had targeted vulnerable women across multiple states, always following the same pattern of psychological manipulation followed by fraudulent competency proceedings. Emma's willingness to testify had given prosecutors the insider perspective they needed to prove intent and coordination. The investigation had uncovered 12 victims in total, women whose lives had been systematically destroyed by Derek's network of corrupt psychiatrists, private investigators, and legal professionals. The financial damage exceeded $3 million, but the psychological trauma was immeasurable. Emma had become the voice for all of them, the one willing to stand up in open court and describe the methodical way predators could dismantle a woman's sense of reality. "There's something I need to tell you before we go in there," Emma said, looking at Tommy with an expression that made him pay closer attention. "The babies, they've been moving differently for the past day, more settling than active movement." Tommy's eyes widened with understanding. "Emma, are you saying—" "I'm saying that these twins might decide to make their debut today, whether Derek's trial is finished or not." Emma managed to smile despite the growing pressure she'd been feeling all morning. "My doctor warned me that stress could trigger early labor, and testifying against the father who tried to destroy my life definitely qualifies as stress." Margaret and Agent Chen exchanged concerned looks. "Emma, if you're in early labor, we can postpone—" "No." Emma's voice carried the authority of a woman who had learned to trust her own strength. "I've been waiting 6 months to look Derek in the eye and tell the truth about what he did. These babies can wait a few more hours." As if to prove her wrong, a contraction swept through Emma's abdomen with enough force to make her gasp and grip Tommy's hand. The 3 people around her immediately shifted into protective mode, but Emma held up her free hand. "That was just a warning shot," she said once the contraction passed. "I'm not delivering in a courthouse waiting room, but we need to move this along." The walk to the courtroom felt surreal, like moving through a dream where every step carried enormous weight. Emma had rehearsed her testimony dozens of times with the prosecution team, but now, feeling her children moving restlessly inside her as if sensing the importance of this moment, everything felt different. She wasn't just seeking justice for herself anymore. She was fighting for the future her twins deserved, a world where predators couldn't hide behind professional credentials and family loyalty. The courtroom was packed with media, legal observers and family members of Derek's other victims, women who had flown in from across the country to see justice served. Emma recognized several faces from the depositions and video conferences that had built the case against Derek's operation. 7 women whose lives had been systematically torn apart by a man who used their trust against them. and 5 others who had been too damaged by their experiences to participate in the legal proceedings. When Derek was led into the courtroom, Emma felt a complex mixture of emotions. He looked smaller than she remembered, his expensive suit unable to hide the stress that had aged him during months of legal proceedings. His dark hair had started going grey at the temples, and there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he'd been manipulating her grief into a weapon against herself. But when his eyes met hers across the courtroom, she saw the same cold calculation that had made her skin crawl during their last encounter in California. For just a moment, Emma felt the old fear trying to reassert itself. The voice Derek had, planted in her mind, that whispered she was too damaged, too unstable, too naive to be believed. But then Tommy's hand found hers, and she felt the babies moving inside her, and she remembered who she had become over the past months. Not Derek's victim, but a woman who had found her voice and learned to use it. The prosecution had built their case methodically, establishing the pattern of behavior across multiple victims before calling Emma as their star witness. Financial. Experts had testified about the sophisticated money laundering operation that had hidden the stolen funds. Psychiatrists had explained how the fraudulent mental health evaluations had been constructed to support predetermined conclusions. FBI agents had detailed the interstate coordination that made this a federal racketeering case. But Emma's testimony would be different. She would put a human face on the clinical descriptions of psychological manipulation, help the jury understand how someone could systematically destroy another person's sense of reality while maintaining a facade of professional concern. When Margaret nodded that it was time, Emma stood carefully, one hand on her belly for balance, and walked to the witness stand with more confidence than she'd felt in years. The bailiff administered the oath, while Emma placed her free hand on the Bible, her voice clear and strong as she swore to tell the truth. "Please state your name for the record," the prosecutor began. "Emma Catherine Hartwell," Emma replied clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the courtroom. The questioning began gently, establishing Emma's background and her relationship with her sister Carrie. Emma described their childhood, their parents' death, and the vulnerability that had made her susceptible to Derek's manipulation. She spoke about the grief that had consumed her after losing her parents, the way Derek had positioned himself as her protector and advocate, while systematically undermining her confidence in her own judgment. "Can you describe the defendant's behavior toward you during the estate proceedings?" the prosecutor asked. Emma looked directly at Derek as she answered, noting how he avoided her gaze. "Derek presented himself as someone who understood my emotional state better than anyone else, including my sister. He would schedule private meetings to go over legal documents, saying I needed extra time to understand complex financial concepts. He made me feel like he was the only person who believed I was capable of independent thought." "And did your relationship with Mr. Paulson evolve beyond these professional consultations?" Here was the moment Emma had been dreading, but she forced herself to speak clearly and without shame. "Derek convinced me that my sister was too controlling, that I needed emotional support from someone who understood my situation. He suggested dinners to discuss my concerns about the estate, then progressed to more personal conversations about my grief and my plans for the future." Emma described the gradual seduction, the way Derek had made her feel special and understood while gathering information about her emotional vulnerabilities. She explained how he documented her reactions to stress, her decision-making processes, even her sleeping patterns, all under the guise of caring concern. "When did you realize you were pregnant?" the prosecutor asked. "About 4 months after my physical relationship with Derek began. I was experiencing what I thought was stress-related illness, But when the symptoms persisted, I went to a clinic for testing. Emma's hand moved to her belly as another contraction began building. When I told Derek about the pregnancy, his entire demeanor changed. The caring, supportive man disappeared, and I saw who he really was. How did he respond to news of your pregnancy? Emma breathed through the contraction while maintaining eye contact with the jury. He told me it was my responsibility to handle the situation, and that if I told my sister about our relationship, he would deny everything and make sure everyone knew about my emotional instability. He said no one would believe me over him because I was clearly having a breakdown. The prosecutor walked Emma through Derek's threats, his coordination with Carrie to have her declared mentally incompetent, and the escalating campaign of harassment that had driven her to flee California. Emma's voice grew stronger with each revelation, the fear Derek had instilled in her transforming into righteous anger. Mr. Paulson attempted to have you involuntarily committed for psychiatric evaluation, the prosecutor said. Can you explain the impact of that threat? It was terrorizing, Emma replied, feeling another contraction building. Derek had convinced my sister that I was mentally unstable, had gathered documentation of my normal grief responses, and presented them as evidence of psychological breakdown. The threat of forced commitment wasn't just about control of my inheritance, it was about taking away my right to make decisions about my own body, my pregnancy, my future. The contraction was stronger this time, making Emma pause in her testimony. She saw concern flash across Tommy's face in the gallery, but she pressed on. How has Mr. Paulson's behavior affected your ability to trust and form relationships? The prosecutor asked. Emma considered the question carefully, thinking about the months of healing that had brought her to this moment. Derek didn't just steal money or manipulate legal documents. He taught me to doubt my own perceptions, to question my emotional responses, to believe that anyone who showed me kindness must have ulterior motives. The damage from that kind of manipulation lasts long after the money is recovered. And how has that affected your ability to move forward with your life? Emma's hand moved to her belly as another contraction began, this one with an urgency that couldn't be ignored, but she refused to let it derail her testimony. It made me afraid to trust anyone, afraid to build relationships, afraid that anyone who showed me kindness had ulterior motives. But it also taught me that I'm stronger than I thought I was, and that there are people in the world who offer help without expecting to own you in return. Her eyes found Tommy in the gallery, seeing pride and love and concern all mixed together in his expression. Another contraction was building, this one with an intensity that made her grip the witness stand rail. "Your Honor," Emma said, addressing Judge Martinez directly, "I believe I need to wrap up my testimony quickly. These babies have decided they'd like to meet their mother's support system sooner rather than later." A ripple of surprise and concern went through the courtroom. Judge Martinez leaned forward with maternal concern. "Ms. Hartwell, do you need medical attention?" "I need to finish what I came here to do," Emma replied firmly, breathing through another contraction. "Mr. Paulson destroyed my trust in my own judgment for months. He tried to steal my children's future before they were even born. But he failed because he underestimated what a woman will do to protect her family." The prosecutor, recognizing that time was running short, asked his final question. "Ms. Hartwell, in your opinion, was Mr. Paulson's behavior toward you part of a calculated plan to gain control of your inheritance?" "Absolutely," Emma said without hesitation. "Every kindness was calculated. Every gesture of support was designed to gather information he could use against me later. Derek Paulson is a predator who uses women's trust and vulnerability as weapons against them. He doesn't deserve anyone's sympathy or consideration." As if responding to her words, a much stronger contraction swept through Emma's body. This time, She couldn't hide her gasp, and Tommy was already moving toward the witness stand. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said quickly, "the prosecution rests." The defense attorney, clearly thrown by the dramatic turn of events and the power of Emma's testimony, waived cross-examination. Derek's face had gone pale as he watched Emma's testimony, punctuated by the imminent arrival of children he would never have the right to know. "Court is adjourned pending jury deliberation," Judge Martinez announced. "Ms. Hartwell, I believe you have more pressing matters to attend to." Tommy reached the witness stand just as Emma's water broke, the dramatic timing sending another ripple of surprise through the courtroom. With Margaret calling 911 and Agent Chen providing surprisingly competent coaching, Tommy helped Emma toward the exit as labor progressed with alarming speed. Emma made it exactly halfway to the hospital before the twins decided they weren't waiting for proper medical facilities. Her daughter arrived on the side of Highway 26 with Tommy holding Emma's hand and promising that everything would be okay, while Margaret provided coaching and Agent Chen directed traffic around their impromptu delivery room. "She's perfect," Tommy whispered, looking down at the tiny face that was already showing signs of her mother's determination. "She's absolutely perfect." Her son followed 20 minutes later in the hospital emergency room, both babies healthy and vocal in their displeasure at the dramatic circumstances of their arrival. The medical team assured Emma that despite the unconventional delivery, both children were strong and developing normally. "They're perfect," Tommy said again, looking down at the two tiny faces that were already showing distinct personalities. Baby girl was calm and alert, studying the world with serious dark eyes that reminded him of Emma's focused concentration. Baby boy was vocal and restless, making his displeasure with hospital blankets known to everyone within hearing distance. "They're ours," Emma said softly, then looked at Tommy with eyes full of tears and hope. "If you want them to be." Tommy's answer was to lean down and kiss her forehead gently, his large hands cradling one of the babies with surprising tenderness. "Emma Hartwell, will you marry me? Will you let me be their father and your husband? Will you build a family with me?" Emma looked at this good man who had given her sanctuary when she had nowhere else to go, who had stood by her through legal battles and federal investigations, who had held her hand through the scariest moments of her life. "Tommy Brennan, there's nothing I want more." 3 hours later, Margaret arrived with news that sent cheers through the hospital room. The jury had convicted Derek on all counts after deliberating for less than 2 hours. He would spend the next 15 years in federal prison, and the other members of his operation had accepted plea deals that would put them away for nearly as long. "It's over," Margaret said, her professional composure cracking to reveal genuine emotion. "Emma, your courage to testify broke open this entire case. 12 women are going to get their lives back because you refused to stay silent." Agent Chen arrived soon after with updates on the broader investigation. Derek's network reached into 4 states and involved corrupt professionals in law, medicine, and private investigation. The financial recovery efforts are already underway, and we've identified additional victims who were too afraid to come forward initially. Emma held her daughter while Tommy cradled their son, both babies sleeping peacefully despite the celebration around them. "What happens to my sister?" Emma asked quietly. "Carrie will serve 18 months for her role in the conspiracy," Agent Chen replied. "But Emma, her cooperation in the final weeks of the investigation helped us uncover the full scope of Derek's operation. She genuinely believed she was protecting you, and when she realized how she'd been manipulated, she provided crucial evidence." Emma nodded, feeling a complex mixture of sadness and relief. Perhaps someday she and Carrie could rebuild their relationship. But for now, Emma was focused on the family she'd chosen and the future she was building with Tommy. Jake Morrison arrived. That evening, bringing flowers and the satisfied expression of a man who'd seen justice served. "Those babies are lucky," he said, studying the sleeping twins. "They've got parents who know how to fight for what matters." 6 months later, Emma and Tommy were married in a ceremony held in the mountain cabin where their relationship had begun. Baby Sarah, named for Agent Chen, slept peacefully in Emma's arms, while baby James, named for Jake Morrison, charmed the small gathering of guests from his father's embrace. Margaret Foster served as Emma's maid of honor, while Jake Morrison stood as Tommy's best man. Agent Chen attended with her own family, and even some of Derek's other victims flew in to celebrate Emma's new beginning. The guest list was small but meaningful, people who had chosen to be family rather than those connected by blood alone. The twins would grow up knowing they were wanted, protected, and loved by people who had chosen their family deliberately rather than by accident. They would learn that their mother had fought for their future before they were even born, and that their father had loved them from the moment he knew they existed. As Emma and Tommy exchanged vows in the cabin's main room, surrounded by the people who had supported them through their darkest moments, Emma reflected on how completely her life had transformed. The woman who had sat on a crate at a lumber auction, desperate and alone, had become someone who could stand up to predators in federal court and build a family based on mutual respect and genuine love. The mountain cabin still stood in its clearing, now home to a family built from hope and determination rather than obligation. And in the evenings, when the twins were settled for the night, Emma and Tommy would sit by the fire and plan for tomorrow, knowing that some purchases at rural auctions turn out to be the best investments of a lifetime. Emma had learned that love doesn't always arrive the way you expect it. Sometimes it comes through the kindness of strangers who become family, through the courage to tell the truth when it matters most, and through the strength to fight for the future your children deserve. Most importantly, she'd discovered that the strongest foundations are built not on perfect circumstances, but on the choice to keep building even when everything seems impossible. The twins grew up knowing their origin story, how their mother had found sanctuary with a lonely lumberjack who offered shelter without conditions, how justice had been served against those who tried to destroy their family before it could begin, and how love had grown from the simplest of human kindnesses offered at exactly the right moment. And sometimes, late at night, when the mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, Emma would remember that desperate morning at the auction and whisper a prayer of gratitude for the unexpected mercy that had led her home. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.